I feel like we're saying factions a lot. We're going to say it a lot more.
Yeah.
Could we get
ready?
Somebody can get a faction counter, please, and tweet us at Vox Arcana Pod. Is that right, Jake?
Yes.
Yeah. And tell us how many times we say faction, faction, faction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Faction.
Factions. Faction.
Faction. Faction. Faction. Factions.
Factions.
Faction. Faction. Factions.
Faction. Faction.
Faction. Faction. Faction.
Faction.
Faction. Faction. Faction. Faction.
Factions.
Factions.
Faction. Faction. The
Faction.
Barton faction.
Factions. 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 Faction. 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 Faction.
Factions.
Factions. Faction. Factions.
Factions. Faction. Faction.
Faction.
Factions. Faction.
Factions. Faction.
Factions.
Factions. Factions. Faction. Factions. Faction.
Factions. Factions. Faction. Factions. Faction. Faction. Faction.
Faction. Faction. Factions. 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 Factions.
Factions. Faction. Faction.
Faction. Faction.
Faction.
Factions. Factions.
Factions. Faction. Faction. Faction.
Factions. 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 Faction. Factions. Factions.
Faction.
Faction. Factions. Factions.
Factions. Faction. Faction.
Faction. Faction.
Factions. Faction. Faction. Faction.
God.
Factions. Factions. Factions.
Faction. Faction.
Faction.
Faction.
Factions. Faction. 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 Faction.
Faction. Faction. Faction. Faction. Faction.
Factions. Faction. Factions. Faction. 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 Faction.
Factions. Factions.
Factions. Faction. Faction. Factions. Faction. Factions.
Faction. Factions. Factions.
Factions. Faction. Faction.
Factions. Faction.
Faction. Factions. Factions.
Faction. 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 Faction.
Factions.
Factions. Faction. Faction. Faction.
Factions.
Faction.
Faction. Factions. Factions. Faction.
Faction. Factions. Faction.
Faction. Faction. Faction. Factions.
Factions. Factions.
Factions.
Faction. Faction.
Faction.
Faction.
Faction.
Factions. Faction. Faction.
Factions. Faction.
Faction. Faction.
Faction. Faction.
Factions.
Factions. Faction.
Faction. Factions. Faction.
Faction.
Factions. Faction. Factions. Faction.
Factions. Factions.
Factions. I'm really hoping that somebody will do a supercut of every time we said faction this episode, and it'll be like 2 minutes of just exhausting faction, faction, faction.